Russia, arming Ukraine with F-16s could start a nuclear war. Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev warned the West that arming Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets could result in a nuclear war. Russian allies have been threatening to use nuclear weapons for some time now as the war carries on and appears more and more to be unwinnable for the West. This is not the first time Russia has voiced concerns over Western-funded F-16s in Ukraine. NATO member states are currently training Ukrainian pilots to operate F-16s ahead of the expected transfer of the aircraft. Kyiv has been asking for the Western fighter jets for months, saying they were needed to combat Russian air superiority. An accidental, unintentional outbreak of a nuclear conflict is not something to be discarded, which is why all those machinations around Ukraine are dangerous. Medvedev said in an extensive interview with Russian journalists, as quoted by TASS on Thursday. Medvedev cited the U.S.-designed aircraft as a possible trigger, noting that Kyiv wants them despite having no ground infrastructure to operate them. So if one of those planes takes off from a NATO nation on a Ukrainian mission, what would that be? An attack on Russia. I shall not describe what could happen next, he said. Such a development may not be even sanctioned by the NATO leadership and the U.S. Russia says that F-16s are particularly problematic because they can deploy nuclear gravity bombs. The doomsday clock is ticking and has sped up considerably, Medvedev added. To be fair, the doomsday clock has always been close to midnight. Since it was launched in 1947, the furthest from doomsday we've ever been according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is 17 minutes from midnight. Because of its use as a fear-mongering tool, we don't put a lot of stake into what the doomsday clock reads. Rather, pay attention to the rhetoric from the ruling classes. That's far more telling. The outrageous persecution of Julian Assange. Today marks the second and final day in what could very well be Julian Assange's last extradition trial in front of the British High Court. For almost 5 years now, the United States government has been working to get the WikiLeaks founder extradited to the U.S. to face charges that he violated the Espionage Act. Inspired by Daniel Ellsberg's release of the Pentagon Papers back in 1971, Julian Assange founded WikiLeaks in 2006. Assange's vision was to develop an online portal where whistleblowers could submit evidence of corporate or government wrongdoing without needing to identify themselves or risk exposure. Once submitted, teams of volunteers and journalists would parse the documents to determine legitimacy. And, if it was determined to be authentic, publish the material straight to the internet so the public could see for itself. For the last decade and a half, WikiLeaks has broken a number of major stories. Many of the biggest came from the Afghanistan and Iraq war logs, along with the so-called diplomatic cables leak, all published in 2010. The leaked documents revealed that not only had the U.S. government committed numerous war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan in the first decade of the War on Terror, but there had been official efforts to cover them up. The Iraq war logs also brought many details to light about the Central Intelligence Agency's, CIA, use of torture. And, as journalist Kevin Gosztola writes in his excellent book about Assange's current case after President Barack Obama famously refused to prosecute anyone involved or compensate survivors of the program, the diplomatic cables revealed that American officials had meddled in the justice systems of France, Germany, Italy, and Spain to shield CIA agents, U.S. military officers, and Bush administration officials from prosecution related to the torture program. In 2016, tens of thousands of emails of senior Democratic officials and higher-ups at the Democratic National Committee were leaked to WikiLeaks. The emails contained politically damaging revelations for the Hillary Clinton campaign, such as details about a series of private speeches the candidate gave to Wall Street executives, and even some evidence of outright corruption, like the fact that the Democratic National Committee had been sharing upcoming questions with Clinton before primary debates. A year later, the organization obliterated any resulting goodwill it might have enjoyed from the Donald Trump White House when it published the so-called Vault 7 documents. The leaks detailed aspects of the CIA's cyber warfare capabilities, most notably the agency's ability to monitor and remotely control newer cars, smart TVs, personal computers, web browsers, and most smartphones. The leaks infuriated CIA Director Mike Pompeo. In response, he turned the agency's sights on Assange, who had been granted asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London 5 years earlier. The CIA got UC Global, the Spanish company in charge of the embassy's security, to secretly record Assange, including while he met with his lawyers, and to send the recordings back to the CIA, a scheme the head of the company would later be charged for in Spanish court. And according to a stunning Yahoo News report by Zach Dorfman, Sean Naylor, and Michael Isakoff, Pompeo's CIA then plotted to kidnap the WikiLeaks founder by getting UC Global employees to accidentally leave the embassy door open. And further, some senior officials inside the CIA and the Trump administration even discussed killing Assange, going so far as to request sketches or options for how to assassinate him. According to depositions from UC Global employees, the preferred plan was to poison the WikiLeaks founder. Evidently, a different approach was chosen. In 2018, the U.S. indicted Assange for conspiring to obtain classified material all the way back in 2010. A year later, Ecuador revoked Assange's asylum, leading to his April 2019 arrest by London police. The following month, the U.S. requested extradition and added 17 espionage charges against Assange. The extradition process has dragged on for almost 5 years, in large part because of concerns over Assange's safety in U.S. custody. And based on Dorfman, Naylor, and Isakoff's reporting, that's a very reasonable concern. There are so many absurd and outrageous aspects of what the U.S. government has done, is doing, and aims to do to Julian Assange. Chief among them is the fact that everything federal prosecutors want to charge him with under the Espionage Act is composed of entirely legal, and common, components of journalism. The fact that journalists often seek out, obtain, and publish classified material is the reason the U.S. government has been reluctant to prosecute the WikiLeaks founder. If Assange's journalism is a crime, so is much of the journalism at the New York Times, the Associated Press, and every other major outlet in the country. Bizarrely, the lead U.S. prosecutor in the case has tried to dodge that inconvenient fact by suggesting Assange is not entitled to First Amendment rights because he is Australian. But remember, they are charging him with violations of the Espionage Act, a U.S. law. So, in other words, U.S. prosecutors believe that a foreign journalist operating outside of the United States must abide by U.S. law, but that at the same time, the U.S. government is not constrained by its own laws because that journalist is a foreigner operating outside of the United States. Julian Assange is not a spy. Nor is he a terrorist or some Democratic or Republican operative. He is a journalist who foresaw the Internet's potential to empower and protect whistleblowers. The anonymous submission system that Assange and his peers envisioned is now standard across the news industry. The reason Assange has been in various forms of custody for almost 12 years is not because he committed any real crimes, but because he has embarrassed the political establishment. Today, that same political establishment is feigning outrage over the alleged murder of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, as well as the ongoing imprisonment of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich in Moscow, all while it maneuvers to throw a Western journalist into solitary confinement for the rest of his life for daring to break truly incriminating stories. It's up to those of us who do actually care about the truth and who oppose not only the misdeeds of the foreign regimes that our governments want to overthrow but, more urgently, the authoritarianism already at work in our own countries to demand that those in charge of the United Kingdom and U.S. governments abide by the principles they have so far only pretended to embody. And that starts with dropping the charges against Julian Assange. If they refuse to do so, that will reveal more about them than any dissident journalist could. Air Force and Space Force unveil major overhaul to prepare for war with China. The U.S. Air Force and Space Force announced a plan for a major overhaul of force structures to prepare for a future war with China in the Asia-Pacific. The plan was announced on Monday by Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall and other officials and includes a total of 24 changes, including 16 for the Air Force, 5 for the Space Force, and 3 for the entire Department of the Air Force. "We are out of time," Kendall said at the Air and Space Forces Association's Warfare Symposium, which was held in Colorado. Why do I say that? It's not that I enjoy sounding like a broken record. It's because, for at least 2 decades, China has been building a military that is designed, purpose-built, to deter and defeat the United States if we intervene in the Western Pacific. According to Military.com, the majority of the changes are vague renaming and rebranding efforts aimed at focusing on so-called great power competition. But some changes are significant, including bringing back warrant officers, which haven't existed in the Air Force for 65 years. The purpose of the warrant officers would be for them to focus on information and technology warfare. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin said the idea of bringing back the rank is to have airmen who want to code for their country and be network attack people. Alvin also said the Air Force would focus more on large-scale military exercises instead of the smaller-scale drills that it has prioritized for the past few decades. Large-scale means multiple weapon systems, multiple capabilities, coming together in a combat-simulated environment and showing our ability to execute the mission that's going to be expected of us in the high-end conflict, he said. Since taking his post as the civilian head of the Air Force, Kendall has made clear his priority is China. After being sworn in back in 2021, Kendall said, "So what are my intentions now that I have this job?" At a breakfast on Capitol Hill shortly after I was sworn in, I was asked by Senator John Tester what my priorities were. My answer was that I had 3: China, China, and China. While the U.S. is focused on the proxy war in Ukraine and supporting the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, the Pentagon still considers China the top threat. U.S. military officials are preparing for a future direct confrontation with China despite the risk of it escalating into a nuclear war.